Hi everyone, welcome to Psychedelic Conversations. This is your hub for engaging in deep conversations around serotonergic hallucinogens that alter perceptions, affect cognitive processes, induce mystical and spiritual experiences. Enjoy the show. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Psychedelic Conversations podcast. I have with me a very special guest, Carlos Castaneda, and he is the founder and the director of the Ayahuasca Foundation. And he was born and raised in the United States. He has degrees in both art and philosophy. He moved to Iquitos, Peru in 2004 and lived with his first teacher for 4 years before creating the Ayahuasca Foundation in 2008. 2017, he opened the Rialspo Retreat. I hope I said that correctly. And Research Center, and began hosting medical research in 2018. The stage 1 study is actually completed. I'm so excited, and I want to congratulate Carlos because I've learned yesterday actually, and I had some time to look through it. It looks amazing. So I will also send a link to the research study that was also took place in Ayahuasca, in the Ayahuasca Foundation retreat. Carlos appeared in the Netflix series Down to Earth with Zac Efron in 2020 and continues to offer unique educational courses, healing retreats, as well as hosting important research into the traditional use of ayahuasca and plant medicine. Welcome, Carlos. So amazing to have you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
So as always, this is what I like to do on this podcast. Can we go into your story? Because I'm always interested in how our guests end up working with psychedelic medicines, plant medicines, entheogenic medicines. What was the path like? How did they come into it? What's the relationship? So let's begin there, if that's okay. Let's look at your story and how it all began, if you don't mind.
Sure. I don't know exactly what brought me to plant medicine. I have recollections of like buying books on plant medicine when I was probably a teenager, and I know that I was reading Carlos Castaneda books when I was a teenager, and so it's probably too complex to try to figure out all the pieces, but somehow things were leading themselves to me, becoming interested in plant medicine, just plants, just not necessarily psychedelics, although most likely reading Carlos Castaneda like inspired some of my interest in psychedelics specifically. And then of course, experimentation with psychedelics in college or at the end of high school also like certainly accelerated that interest. Specifically with regard to ayahuasca, that would have been through Michael Harner's book, The Way of the Shaman, which opens with his introduction to shamanism being through ayahuasca. And then I got a job working for the University of Massachusetts, where I had access to the internet. I'm 47 years old, so that wasn't that normal back then. And I started to research plant medicine. And so ayahuasca was kind of at the top of my list in that personal research that I was doing. And so, it became something kind of on the back burner of my life because it certainly wasn't like an easy endeavor to try ayahuasca, at least not in the late 90s. And so that just kind of sat there. I talked about ayahuasca to friends. It was something that certainly piqued my interest, but it wasn't something I could say I actively pursued until I found myself happily living with a career job, at least on paper, but really suffering emotionally inside from a lack of satisfaction and a feeling of stagnancy in my life. And that led to trying to numb that with opiates, and that turned into an opiate addiction. And that culminated in me waking up in my car underwater in May of 2003, having blacked out behind the wheel and driven into a river. That was my wake-up call, you could say, quite literally, because I woke up from a blacked out state to find myself underwater. And that was when I really decided that I needed to do something drastic. And I feel like at that point, I kind of made a declaration to the universe, or to myself, or all of the above, that I would do something drastic to make an important transformation in my life. A couple days later, I received an email from a friend of mine who I hadn't seen in a couple years, but who remembered those conversations about ayahuasca when I was kind of at the peak of my interest. And she was in Iquitos, Peru at the time. She had met two individuals from Russia that were working with a shaman, and an authentic shaman, a true shaman in the Amazon rainforest. And she was going to drink ayahuasca, and thought maybe I would like to join her because of the synchronicities of the incident with waking up in my car and the declaration to make a massive transformation in my life. And this seemingly, very bizarre coincidence of providing a path to potentially achieving that transformation. I recognize that as an omen more than a coincidence, and I accepted her offer and invitation. And in May of 2003, I flew down to Peru and drank ayahuasca for the first time, which would be a very transformative experience that I credit to saving my life. And in that experience, which took 3 weeks, over the course of 3 weeks of drinking ayahuasca with the shaman named Don Juan Tangoa, he told me it was my path to be a healer, and he invited me to be his apprentice. And I accepted that offer. And in January of 2004, I moved to Iquitos, Peru, and I began living and studying with him. And then everything just kind of laid itself out before me, or I found each bend of the path as I walked it. And that led me to forming the Ayahuasca Foundation and getting the grants to do the research, or build the research center rather, and then meeting the researchers that would actually do that research, and so many other things, basically, up to now, where we're talking now.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing. I'm fascinated by the way the stories kind of synchronistically come into a path of, becoming a healer, but also it's almost like I spoke to another friend of mine, and he talks about a psychedelic path as a hero's journey. Something really bad happens, and then synchronicities bring it to attention, and then of course you already knew about this, researched and read and had access, but almost like something had to happen, and then you meet the medicine, and then everything changes. The whole trajectory, the life, everything you planned out, or maybe you couldn't even comprehend, just kind of changes. Do you find that a lot? Do you find this is to be a common theme around the people who are on the similar path? I seem to speak to a lot of people, and they always say it's almost like it meant to happen. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I hope, I noticed there was a slight delay. I hope that we're still in a good communication or connection. But yeah, I mean, I think that using the term path is advantageous, because I would look at it as a tool. I can't necessarily say that there's some proof, that there is a path, but as a tool, as a model from which to view our lives, I think is very beneficial. And we're all on our path right now, no matter what, so even though I do feel like I was trying to find my path when I went to the Amazon rainforest, and that I certainly felt for a long time that I found my path, and I to this day feel I found my path, but my path wasn't out there. The idea, the word lends itself that it's something out there, but it's really something in here. It's really a way of looking at the steps you're taking in the current moment and where they lead into the future, and based on where they came from. It's just a connecting of dots, and as soon as you connect dots, you create a line, and that line can be called a path. So I think it's a wonderful model, because it makes something mysterious but yet filled with trust. Like you don't have to figure it out because the path is there already. And so you just have to keep moving forward. And even though you don't know what's around the next bend, you know that it's part of this path. And therefore, whatever it is around this bend is part of what is meant to be. And therefore, you will perceive it in a way that looks for the opportunities and lessons inherent in each experience rather than judge it as positive or negative. So the path kind of builds a trust and a positive outlook into the way that we approach our lives and interpret our experiences, which is obviously very, very beneficial.
Yeah, I love that explanation. And was it part of your work to learn to trust? Because, coming from a very modern world and we don't seem to trust much. We tend to like to be in the known, and also we like the certainty, we like the security. And somehow the plant medicines, they show us the complete opposite. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. Well, I mean, psychedelics and ayahuasca specifically, which is obviously going to be like, when I say psychedelics, most of the time I'm going to be speaking specifically about ayahuasca, but I do feel like it does like encompass the entire category of psychedelics. They expand our awareness. So they give us access to more information through the amplification of sensory perceptive abilities. So, when you're in an amplified sensory perceptive state, when you have access to more information, then you have an expanded awareness. And part of what happens within that expanded awareness is the realization that, like all the trillion of cells that make up me, I am a part of a quadrillion, whatever infinite number of individuals that make up a greater whole, much more wise and much more powerful than I could possibly imagine. And whether that be the earth or the galaxy or the universe, it's not as important, just knowing that I'm a part of something, that even though I recognize myself as an individual, I don't coincidentally happen to cohabitate this planet with all these other beings. We are all part of this in collaboration, just the same way that I know my cells as individuals are in collaboration to be who I am. And so that comes almost naturally from this expanded awareness. Now, of course, when it's guided by the ancestral paradigm of the indigenous plant medicine traditions, like it is in the work that we do in the Amazon rainforest, that's also built into their ideologies. That's built into their philosophy, their religion, their perspective, or their reality about what the world is this interconnectedness. But when you feel it, as a result of that amplified sensory perceptive ability or that expanded awareness, then you feel supported. Then you feel like, okay, well, just like my cells have a role, they've got a plan, each cell has a function. That's why they come into existence, and that's what they do. They're always guided by this overarching consciousness of my being, but they have a path. And I must also then have a path. And that's why these pieces come together. And that's why synchronicities happen. And while I can't explain the synchronicities, I can recognize them. And thus I build that trust or that faith, really, that it's all happening the way it's supposed to, or it's all unfolding as it's meant to.
I love that. I think the greater the awareness, the greater the trusting in ourselves. I love that explanation. Thank you so much. So let's tie into your offerings. So there is, you organize ancestral psychedelic therapy retreats and courses. I think it's a great time to kind of go into that a little bit. Maybe it will tie in with this. What are the teachings? And of course, the Shipibo tradition, the way the ayahuasca is kind of facilitated and also taught. Maybe you can explain to us your offerings and your courses and the whole encompassing learning with the ayahuasca medicine.
Right. Well, I appreciate you using that term. I just coined that term, ancestral psychedelic therapy, as a response to the movement or expansion of awareness of psychedelic therapy that seems to be like exploding right now. But I do feel there's an important distinction, because the work that we're doing, even though it is with psychedelic substances and is certainly under the category of psychedelic therapy, it is part of an ancestral tradition that goes way back, generations upon generations upon generations, a true science of plant medicine that has brought us to the current therapeutic ideologies and methodologies. And like what I referenced before, like when the use of ayahuasca is guided by the ancestral traditions, it encompasses a different paradigm. It works within a different reality, a separate reality, as Carlos Castaneda would call it. And so the tradition can be looked at, in a series of levels. Generally speaking, a psychedelic tradition, more specifically an ayahuasca tradition, an Amazonian ayahuasca tradition, the indigenous tradition of the Shipibo tribe. Within that, we work specifically with two families, the Mahuas and the Lopez families, and those two families work with a very unique tradition, a familial lineage that is very unique. In fact, it is unique only to those two families, and that is the work surrounded by or centered on the connection and relationship with a bioluminescent tree called Noya Rao. And so the retreats that we offer are offered and led by indigenous curanderos from the Shipibo tribe, but within this family tradition that works and connects with the bioluminescent tree Noya Rao. So we have an 8-week course that's what we call our initiation course, where students have a chance to do plant dietas with Noya Rao, as well as 4 other master plants or teacher plants. And then we have a 4-week empowerment course where students or participants of that course are able to do plant dietas with Bobansana, which is another important teacher plant. The dietas is a whole another podcast probably, and I'm happy to do another podcast with you to talk more about it because it's such an important detail within the tradition. But it's now gaining more popularity and understanding, but it's still a very complex concept to understand from the modern paradigm or the modern reality, because it is a specific activity to build relationships with the spirits of plants. And so, there's 100 things already that are obviously like hard to put the pieces together when you're stuck in a scientific paradigm of the modern culture that doesn't recognize spirit, especially not within plants. So, but that is the nature of it. And that is a great example of what I mean by the ancestral paradigm, where it views everything having a spirit and having all of our spirits essentially be part of a body of consciousness, a spiritual being, and then working within that alternate dimension to address inaccurate personal truths that were formed by inaccuracies within our interpretation of our experiences, or more generally just traumas. And so the main purpose of the treatments that we have in those courses as well, but we have shorter programs that are 10-day retreats and 18-day retreats, is to really target and address the inaccurate personal truths that were created and formed during other hypersensitivity states, but those hypersensitivity states were usually caused or the result of extreme fear or terror, and the misinterpretations led to inaccurate personal truths that unfortunately infect our personal perceptions and the dynamics of the relationships that we have. So by addressing and resolving those inaccuracies of interpretation and then replacing them with better interpretations that lead to beneficial positive truths, resolving the traumas essentially, and achieving that through the heightened awareness, creating a hypersensitivity state through the use of psychedelic substances like ayahuasca that matches or overrides the hypersensitivity that was brought about by fear during the trauma. Then once those personal truths are resolved or replaced with beneficial ones, then the rest kind of takes care of itself. Of course, there's a whole body of plant medicine associated and coordinated with the use of the ayahuasca ceremonies that helps that process along as well. So it's all fascinating, but I guess to sum it up would be that it strives to reach the core of what has happened in imbalances in people's lives on a spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical level. And by resolving those imbalances at their core, then the symptoms or the expressions of those imbalances on all those other levels start to mend themselves. Because ultimately, the healing isn't really done by anything beyond ourselves or the divine principle of healing that we recognize. Even when we cut ourselves, we know that it heals. And when we see damage done in a forest, for example, it heals. And healing is built into the biological system or the life system or our spirit. It's just a question of removing the obstacles that might be preventing that from being achieved.
I love that. Thank you so much for clear explanation. So I think it's a great time to open a little window for maybe some of our listeners just found us and they don't really know much about ayahuasca, because we're talking about the medicine we're talking about here is ayahuasca. Maybe we can talk about what medicine this is and its properties, and yeah, maybe you can tell us a little bit about ayahuasca. And then what I'd like to do is maybe mention a little bit about dieta. Why is it different than just going to ceremonies, for example? What makes it different? And then I want to come back to the trauma and the healing, maybe a little bit more in detail, because I've got a couple of questions that I think you're the right person to ask about trauma. And only because my background is in also somatic experiencing and trauma-informed therapy. And some of my colleagues, they always say that ayahuasca or any other psychedelic medicine shouldn't be used when there is a severe trauma. But I think we can get into that maybe later. So tell us about ayahuasca. Imagine if somebody's listening to this for the first time, they have no idea what we're talking about. And then
Sure.
we can move into dieta.
Right. Ayahuasca. The word ayahuasca refers to two things. One, it refers to a plant known scientifically as Banisteriopsis caapi. It's a vine that grows only in the Amazon rainforest. And it also refers to the medicine made from that vine. And when the medicine is made, typically it's made from two different plants, one being the ayahuasca vine and then another admixture plant that is often, and in the Shipibo tradition, exclusively the plant called chacruna, which is scientifically known as Psychotria viridis, although other regions use other plants because they might have access to different plants. So there's usually an admixture plant along with the ayahuasca vine, although it's important to note that there are certain tribes, even to this day, that have never used an admixture plant, and their medicine called ayahuasca is only with the ayahuasca vine. The mixture of those two plants from a modern chemical perspective is the combination of harmines and tetraharmines found in the vine, which we classify as MAOIs or monoamine oxidase inhibitors that prevent the enzyme monoamine oxidase from being produced by the body as a natural response to the ingestion of particular substances that need to be broken down by that enzyme. And one of those substances happens to be dimethyltryptamine, which is found in the Psychotria viridis plant, or the chacruna. Dimethyltryptamine is also produced by human beings and by all living beings. It's in our blood. Rick Strassman, in his book, The DMT, the Spirit Molecule, proposed the notion that it is produced by our pineal gland, which is also referred to as our third eye, and that it is produced in a singular event about 49 days into the development of the embryo, at which point it would become a fetus, suggesting the potential that that is the moment when spirit enters the body in a newly born or newly developing human. And then again, in a singular event, the pineal gland produces a large amount of dimethyltryptamine at the moment of death, suggesting that that could be an expression chemically of an event of the spirit exiting the body. It's going to be hard to try to validate that information, but those were the proposals that he suggested. Clearly, there's something spiritual about the substance dimethyltryptamine, but I think there's a lot more to it, and I think the simple fact that the medicine is called ayahuasca rather than chacruna kind of lends itself to a different understanding than what chemists want to find. And that can be resolved by the understanding of spirit. So when you're working with the medicine ayahuasca, it's possible, but just rare, that people have powerful interactions with the spirit of chacruna, but they most commonly have powerful interactions with the spirit of ayahuasca. And so the medicine is taken essentially to amplify sensory perceptive ability, like I mentioned earlier, which would enable us to see beyond the visible spectrum into frequencies of light that would normally be invisible, which would allow us to see the invisible, or what would normally be invisible simply because of our biological limitations, and thus see spirit, see into what could be called another dimension, if you want to define dimensions by biological limitations. And also it amplifies our auditory spectrum, to hear sounds beyond our normal ability to hear. Just like we know dogs can hear higher frequencies than humans, we have biological limitations that prevent us from hearing certain frequencies of sound, just like we have biological limitations that prohibit us from seeing certain frequencies of light. But in an ayahuasca ceremony, especially when the ceremony is using its known development of methodology, like doing it in the darkness of night without light, to also further enhance light sensitivity in the eyes, then you can see and communicate with spirits. And that's really the purpose why people drink ayahuasca, and then gain insights through that communication and connection with spirits that can then be brought back to the real world, so to speak, and put into practice to achieve benefit. And some of that's quite literal in terms of like finding the plant medicine that will heal the problem that you have. Sometimes the work is done right in the ceremony, like I mentioned before, like replacing detrimental personal truths with beneficial ones through the reinterpretation of previous experiences that were misinterpreted. And sometimes it's about changing behavior, changing a plan, or expanding your understanding. Like, for instance, maybe you come to recognize that your parents were children too, and that the conditioning they had as children led them to be the way that they are now, which you might have had a problem with them in the dynamics of your relationship, but by coming to a better understanding of their own conditioning and perhaps the trauma that they suffered, you can come to a better understanding that allows you to forgive more easily. And so forgiveness is certainly like a big theme that happens in the healing process in general, but especially with ayahuasca ceremonies as well. So it's a really fascinating tradition, a fascinating topic of conversation, and a really fascinating medicine.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I'm sure the medicine is used for many, many illnesses, diseases, probably for many other things, but because of our time is so limited here together. So I just wanted to focus on the trauma healing. Seems like it's very, very popular right now. Seems like, especially the post-pandemic era, we're now living in a post-pandemic world. And coming from a therapy background, I do understand that we're probably going to see the real implications, the real detrimental effects in the next couple of years. Maybe, it's always the way, isn't it? You always end up exposing to the real effects of what actually happened. So I know that's going to come, not to scare anybody here, but it's just the reality of going through such a shocking event in our lives. This could be a trauma, right? COVID, the process of the COVID and prolonged lockdowns, uncertainty, fear. I also relate that it's also brought a lot of suppressed trauma, early traumas to the light. So many people had tendencies to depression, probably were functioning before, now they cannot, because suddenly the shock of this, the COVID scare, the uncertainty kind of brought everything to the light, and almost giving an opportunity maybe to deal and heal. It's an opportunity for sure, but it's hard when you're living in that depressive and anxious state. And I just want to tie this in with the research that's currently published. What a timely, research study. Like I said, I managed to read about half portion, and it's so promising. And since it's done through you and your foundation, I think it would be best to hear from your side, your perspective. How was this study taken? When was it? When did it start, first of all? And yeah, can walk us through all of it, would be so amazing.
That's a lot to walk through. You've covered quite a bit there. So the study definitely like focused on trauma, but it looked at the markers of depression and anxiety because there were already well-established psychological measures for that. There are evaluations that have been developed over the last decade or possibly longer than that. So it was very easy to just take those and put them into place. It's not as easy to measure trauma, although those are certainly being developed now as well. I agree with you 100%. I mean, to me, I feel like all of illness can be attributed to what I would call trauma. But I think maybe it's important to describe how trauma is an event of response. You know, it is not an activity or an experience. It is a description of a negative response to an experience. And so typically a trauma is associated with fear. That would be the most prominent negative response. And so a perfect example actually is like a roller coaster. You know, two people could ride a roller coaster and sit right next to each other on the exact same ride. But one person could respond tremendously positively to that ride. And then it could have a potential effect that they would go on to take risks in their lives and you know, like take chances that might pay off in the long run in a multitude of different ways. And then the other person might respond negatively as a result of the fear response. And not only will they never ride a roller coaster again, but they will also take fewer risks and fewer chances in their lives, which might play out that they don't ever trust themselves to fall in love, or don't ever trust themselves to get involved in deep relationships that could be a part of the fulfillment that they deserve as human beings. So, you know, you could see how just the response to the same experience, one could be considered a trauma and the other could be considered a gift or a benefit or blessing. And so I think that's really, really important, because that's ultimately what I view the healing process to be, is transforming the response, or what I want to call the interpretation of the response, into something that becomes a blessing instead of what it was as a trauma. Now, the trouble with that is that we know from our experiences of having fear that it's not just an idea. You know, it would be great, and we all play that game where we have fear and we try to think our way out of it, but it can't be done so simply. It would be wonderful if we could just think our way out of fear or other emotions, but it's clearly tied to physiological activity. The response is physiological, and so physiological is a part of our senses. We feel a certain way. You know, our senses are producing information for us, and we're acknowledging that, and we're processing that, and that's part of the interpretation process. Sometimes you can have sensations and say this is great, and sometimes you can have sensations and say this is terrible, and people will determine what they measure or how they view those sensations on a personal level. And a lot of that has to do with all of their previous experiences. You know, someone could like walk down the street and see a dog and think that's awesome. And another person could be like, oh my God, you know, and you know, we all recognize that. The important part of that is what I was getting to before, that fear creates, I believe, evolutionarily, a heightened sensory perceptive ability. To me, it's logical that if we recognize ourselves and determine that we are fearful for our survival, that level of fear, then the natural response for our survival would be to give us the greatest chance of awareness, the heightened awareness to figure out what we need to figure out in order to survive. So our eyes need to see the best that they can. Our ears need to hear the best that they can. We have to have hypervigilance. You know, we have to produce that in as a benefit so that we can survive whatever this happens to be. And that hypervigilance, unfortunately, creates this kind of disaster atmosphere for trauma to be formed. Because when you come to a decision in a hypersensitive state, it reaches the full spectrum of sensory perception. But when you return back to your normal daily life, which is a more limited perceptive ability, now you have realms, you have frequencies of that determination, that decision, that truth, I want to call it, that are now outside of your realm of perception. They still exist, just like we know that frequencies of light exist, even though we can't see them. They're still there. And that is why it's so challenging to change them. It's so challenging to replace them, because we cannot access them. They're beyond our sensory perceptive ability. Unless we have something that creates a heightened sense of awareness, or that matches or overrides that amplification of sensory perceptive ability, we won't be able to access fully the entirety of the spectrum of personal truth that was formed as a result of the trauma. Psychedelics provide that opportunity to override our sensory perceptive ability, or expand it to such a degree that we can fully access the entirety of the personal truths formed by our inaccurate interpretations, which are traumas. And thus, by doing so, we can replace those truths and reevaluate our interpretation and retroactively change the way that we respond, so that in the future, we won't have that response again, and thus have a different truth that relates to how we view ourselves, and especially how we interact with other people and the dynamics of our relationship.
That's so powerful. That's so profound way of explaining. Thank you so much for that. So, and this brings us to...
Sorry, I totally missed the scientific research. I felt like it was more important to talk about the trauma. So
no, this was so good. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, quite simply, the research was done, evaluations that are already established, psychological evaluations that give numerical measurements of depression scales, anxiety scales. There's a lot of different categories within those that were measured using 4 different evaluations that are already established within the field of psychiatry and psychology. They were given before a participant attended a retreat. They were given again after the participant finished the retreat, and then they were given again 6 months later. And I think the most valuable part of the research, because I think that anyone that's drunk ayahuasca, or maybe even just taken a psychedelic, and certainly I knew that the results would be a drastic decrease in symptoms of depression and anxiety after the retreat. But 6 months later, with no treatment, no additional treatment during that 6-month period, I actually would have suspected that it would have returned a little bit. That there would have been a significant decrease in depression, for example, but then maybe the depression came back a little bit, but still significantly lower than the 6-month period before the retreat. But it actually was better than that there was this drastic reduction as a result of the retreat, and 6 months later, it continued to lower. And that, to me, is very, very important, because if you were to compare that to, say, the pharmaceutical method of treating depression, where you put someone on antidepressant medication, you would not see that result. You would not see that someone start taking their antidepressant medication, and then there's a lowering of the symptoms of depression, and then they stop taking their antidepressant medication and it continues to go down. That doesn't happen. But in this case, it did. And that is when you start to consider long-term effect of a singular treatment. And that isn't that what we're all aiming for? Can I have a singular event that cures depression, that even when I don't have the treatment anymore, when I'm not taking the medication anymore, I get better still? And that, to me, is an example or a demonstration of a true transformation.
This is exciting. And yeah, we'll definitely add the link in the comments for our listeners to have a look and read the research study as well. And I just want to quickly open a window about what you said earlier, where psychedelics, they amplify our sensory perception so that we can start to heal. So this goes to show, also reminds me the Dr. Stan Grof, he always says, healing always happens in non-ordinary states. I think there is a truth to that, because as you said, also in the somatic experiencing, there are movement practices, there are breathwork practices that kind of increases the sensory perception, so that the person can enter into a state where they're more hyper aware of what's going on, so they can connect to their body. So from what I understand, and this is probably a very simple, practical explanation of why psychedelic medicines or entheogens or plant medicines have the potential to heal people, because they allow us to go into these states. It's just very clear for us. And also reminds me to talk about, it's not the medicine that heals us, it's us. Once we enter these states, then an opportunity, a space opens for us for reflection, for introspection, and for going through a lot of somatic experiencing, purging, a lot of heightened, perceived, like you said as well, reflecting on why this could happen, and also grow in compassion. All of this happening at once in one ceremony is incredible. And I also want to tie it back to the research study where you said they kept declining the symptoms. They never had to. I mean, this study is so profound, but can we also talk about how now that people are going to be more interested in medicines, just because now we have mainstream media, we have now scientists, neuroscientists, psychiatrists coming into the space and running these research studies. And now we have a lot of body of work coming, a lot is coming now. I'm seeing it everywhere. So, and unfortunately, some way it's still quite scary that we don't have centers like yours. We don't have, you must have really good sort of integration processes, maybe preparation, maybe during and after. So now this kind of, do you think this will heighten the risk of people just chasing the healing and not really going through the research and going through like to find a trusted person, to trusted retreat, and really not understand, but just wanting the quick fix? Are you seeing any risks that could come through this?
Well, I mean, of course, there's always, there's no way that you're going to avoid risks. In fact, actually, just take a look at pharmaceutical medication and you'll see the most incredible list of risks that I can't even believe why people would ever take a pill. But of course, like there will always be risks, and there's always positive and negative happening across the board. One of the reasons why I coined the phrase ancestral psychedelic therapy was because I was seeing what I perceived to be an introduction of new drugs on the market into the exact same system that is, to me, clearly failing. And so to me, it's not about the substance. It's not about which medicine you choose to take. It's really about the context of your understanding of health and how to achieve it and how to improve it and how to maintain it. That needs changing. And that's why I use the term ancestral, because the ancestral perspective or the ancestral reality is very, very distinct than our current reality. And all of it comes together. Some of it we might try to compartmentalize as if it's like, oh, that's spiritual or that's religious or one is scientific and the other one is philosophical, but you can't really compartmentalize reality. All of it is deeply interconnected, and the idea that it is separate is the failure. That's like the core of the failure. In fact, I think there's an obvious example of that where there was some like biosphere built in Arizona that was supposed to create these little mini worlds so that they could be studied. And very quickly, the whole thing collapsed and everything died because there was no interconnection. And so even though we might think that the desert of Africa is separate from the rainforest of Brazil, they aren't. They rely on each other, and the entirety of the planet Earth is this incredible collaboration. And once we start to incorporate that into our understanding of our own individual health, then I think that we'll be on the right direction. But if we're just going to replace Prozac with ketamine, then I don't think that we're going to make the strides that we could be because we're not actually transforming our understanding. That's kind of what I'm on a mission to do, what I feel like it's my role to do. Because I was so fortunate to spend 17 years in the Amazon rainforest, I was able to kind of get a foot firmly in that paradigm. But yet, because I was raised in the United States, I still keep my other foot like in the modern paradigm. And by having one foot in each, I'm able to maybe find ways to bridge gaps of understanding and increase the overlap between the two paradigms. But I would love to see more incorporation of those ancestral methodologies and ideologies into modern medicine than just taking new substances and inserting them into the same system, which I feel is terribly flawed at its core. So one of the things in terms of like integration that you're seeing now with psychedelic therapy and the development of psychedelic therapy that differs so drastically is that we offer our programs and other programs like them are full immersions. They're fully immersive. So no one is going to an ayahuasca ceremony at our retreat and then going back to the world. They're staying there. They're staying there, and they stay there for a minimum of 10 days, and sometimes they stay for up to 8 weeks. And that is a very, very different type of therapy than you're seeing with a lot of other psychedelic therapies that are currently being developed, which are maybe like you go and you do a session one afternoon, and then you go home to all of the same environments and the same conditions and the same problems, essentially, and all of those influences that were probably contributing to why you were having problems in the first place. And so it's kind of like 2 steps back, 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, every step of the way. It can be, productive in that manner, but it's clear that it would be much more productive to take a person completely out of their environment. Here's a great metaphor that I think is perfect. If you have a fish tank and you notice that your fish, let's just say you have one fish for ease, your fish is sick. Well, you could like try to study the fish and see like what's happening inside the fish. But chances are, if you've ever had a fish tank, you know it's the fish tank. You know that the fish tank is the problem, not the fish. So what you would do is you would take the fish out of that fish tank and you would put it in a good environment where you can make sure that the environment it's in is perfect, And while you're there, you clean out the fish tank. You kind of you set it all up. Maybe there's some problem with the water is toxic. Maybe there's algae in there. Something is clearly making that fish sick, and it's a fish tank. And then when you've got the fish tank better set up, you take the fish that's probably already healthy now because it's been outside of the environment that was causing it to be unhealthy, and you put it back in a new healthy environment. That is like fish care 101, Everybody knows that if you've ever had a fish tank, that's what you have to do. And yet we're living in a society where we're still trying to like find the problem inside the fish. And so if you take a person out of the fish tank and you fully immerse them in the most healthy environment possible, and the same could be said about plants, this isn't just fish phenomena. Obviously, it's a metaphor for all of life. You take them out, you immerse them in the most healthy environment possible, you recuperate their health. But then that's the integration process. What is the plan for when they're coming back? How do they clean their fish tank? And those are the insights that are developed during that retreat. It's called the retreat for a reason. You're like leaving the battlefield. You're going to a place of safety to recover. And the integration is that plan that comes through the insights that I talked about with those interconnections in the spiritual dimension, and also through the guidance of the people that you're with, which I also think is very, very important to recognize. That I think at one point you said, and we didn't talk about it, that you've heard people say that plant medicines shouldn't be used for people with deep trauma. That to me is a statement that exists in the modern paradigm. because it looks at the medicine as if it is a substance on its own. And that is a part of the core failure of modern medical understanding, is that we think that the medicine acts by itself instead of in the context of an important and powerful ideology and methodology that in ayahuasca we call tradition. Tradition speaks to a separate reality, a separate methodology, and a separate ideology that work in collaboration the same way that gardening, and I'm sorry to go with another metaphor, but I want to make sure that it's understood. The seed grows the plant. You want to grow tomatoes, you need tomato seeds for sure. But the tomato seed doesn't grow by itself. You have to fertilize your soil. You have to prepare the space that seed's going to go in. That's gardening. And then you have to give it water. You have to give it light. You have to give it the right ratios. It needs the right nutrients. All of that actually makes the tomato grow. So yeah, you need the seed. You need the medicine, but you need the gardening of the soil, the context around which the medicine is taken for the medicine to be activated and achieve its goal to grow, seek roots, blossom, and bear fruit. That is the reality that comes from the ancestral paradigm that we are not employing in the Western modern medicine. And so it's not so much to say that you shouldn't take this substance if you have this problem, because that's ignoring the context. It's the context that is the most important part. It's the tradition that is the most important part over the substance. And if we spent much more time focusing on that and incorporating those elements into modern medicine, we would have a much more efficient and successful medical practice.
Yeah, beautifully said. I'm 100% with you. I think it's a whole lifestyle change. It's a whole taking somebody and really educating them into their internal and external environment. It's not just about taking the medicine and going home. There's a lot of work to be done around the medicines. And unfortunately, based on what I'm observing, I'm actually observing many psychedelic medicine communities. And I'm kind of very curious how people are looking at these medicines and how they're approaching them. Most often than not, I always come across posts or sharings that a lot of people share really negative and insane stuff about that they were activated and they were left alone and nobody cared, and the facilitator didn't really give any information. I'm sure this is like the dark side of the medicines, but I like to always bring to our attention in these podcast episodes, because I just like to be, I just want our listeners to be informed that there is also this side. There is also where people really don't take care of these medicines, and they introduce people to, and they carry them without real training, real education, and real understanding. And just because we have this conditioning in the West that we can take a substance and then it's a quick fix, I can just imagine why this can be a very popular thing. I can just imagine it's just a no-brainer, right? It's not rocket science for a Western world, people who are conditioned to take aspirin for headache, and it's 15 minutes and it's going to go away. So I'm seeing a lot of people treating the medicines the same way. I'll go to a ceremony one afternoon, like you said earlier, and I'll be done. I'll come home and it's a magic wand and I'll start changing my life. But like you said, they come back to the same toxic environment. They don't really know how to work with this environment. They don't have the tools because they haven't really learned or have the capacity, at least, because our most traumatic and most toxic relationships are the intimate family relationships, our very intimate social connections in our families. So imagine, most often I see people going for ceremonies, ayahuasca ceremonies, coming back, instead of building the capacity to deal with the dysfunctional family relationships, they rather just say, okay, I'm going to forgive them. I see this as a bypassing using the medicine, because it's hard to implement boundaries and clean up the tank, the fish tank. So therefore, just because the medicine kind of increases compassion and increases all of these, deeper levels of connecting, but then they come back and say, okay, I'm going to forgive all of these people that were doing all these things to me, because this is what the medicine is all about. I've taken the medicine, now I'm going to forgive everybody. And this is probably a deepest bypassing in the medicine work. I'm not sure, what are you seeing in your retreats? Do you deal with a lot of difficult people who come in and with high expectations? You probably know, I think you understand what I mean.
Right. Well, I mean, people, to do a retreat, people set in motion the healing process long before I ever see them, or long before they ever step foot in the Amazon rainforest. Because once they click the register button for a retreat, that sets in motion their own physiological responses to that commitment. But also it starts in motion a set of communications that they have directly with me, including a pre-retreat counseling session that I do via Zoom. And so, by the time they arrive to a retreat, no one has a false expectation or an idea that this is some sort of wonder drug or something. And then again, like throughout the retreat, that is discussed pretty much daily as part of the integration process to prepare people for when they go back to their environments. And then again, like we have an integration session, a post-retreat integration session with each. I do a session with each person after a retreat also. So it's not something that I see. I think that's part of like what would be more beneficial for processes like that. And I think that also kind of lends itself to that same comment about the context. I will say, like, in terms of the forgiveness, forgiveness to me, I think has been redefined. Well, it certainly has been redefined. I think that before working with ayahuasca, I definitely felt like forgiveness was something that I did for someone. But now I recognize that I do it for myself, that I give myself the ability to love again. And so it's certainly not about forgetting. I don't know why those two things are put together often, where you forgive and forget. I don't think that the two should be put together. You certainly shouldn't be forgetting, but do you want to liberate yourself from the chains of your inability to love as a result of this? I certainly would rather be liberated. And so, if I don't know what the context are, what the meaning is when in those examples that you were giving, but I do promote forgiveness as a liberation from our inability to love, so that we can regain that ability to love. And that is what I, define forgiveness as now, but it's certainly not connected to forgetting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was talking more about maybe it's the work that I'm doing and maybe the communities that I'm observing. I'm engaging with a lot of people who come from a very, very deep generational trauma. And they continue, it's quite dysfunctional family dynamics. And one of the most hardest things, it's almost like they've chained to these kind of dynamics. If one starts to take medicine and start their healing journey, it's like the whole thing crashes down. And then that's why I see a lot of people relapsing, or at least not have it. I mean, they kind of need a lot of encouragement, a lot of capacity, a lot of education, a lot of doing a whole lifestyle change. And I think this is what really scares people. That's why they end up quitting, or they end up, like I said, relapsing, or at least just staying stagnant where they are. And that's why we need retreats like yours, where there is a whole lot going on and that people are really taken away from their environment and they've really gone through their own individual work. And that's why I keep bringing to our attention, because now with the mainstream media coming so fast with the medicines as the new therapy, I know so many people just wanting that quick fix, and these ceremonies are happening all around the world, not just in the jungle, but everywhere in cities right now as we speak, with facilitators that they haven't really gone through deep training. And this was like my concern, of course, is always, I feel like I'm responsible to mention, in case somebody listens to the podcast and they have no idea, their first time hear it, because I did when I first came into the medicine space. I just thought everybody is genuine, and every facilitator had gone through a deep training and understanding. That was my biggest misconception. That's why I always bring it up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as soon as you talk about spirituality in a modern world that doesn't recognize spirit, there's a lot of confusion. And so I do see that a lot of people like create their own definition of what spirituality is. And oftentimes that means that they impose like a guru idea on a practitioner or a person that they also like project spirituality onto. And that's, to me, that's simply because we just don't have spirit at the core of our identity. It's something like on the fringe, it's like some new age idea that you seek out, which is the most, it's like a bizarre concept from an indigenous perspective that you could ever seek out something that is actually you. But so I again, like I would attribute that more to the challenges of trying to come to fill the hole that we've lost when we destroyed the concept of spirit within modern culture, in favor of science, which, science and spirit, it's like you can't say those two words in the same sentence together. And so, of course, there's certainly problems. I know myself, like, in fact, it was a big inspiration for our 8-week course, which is essentially like a training course for people that do feel like they want to lead ceremonies, so that they have, at the very least, a very basic understanding, which I wasn't seeing in the ceremonies that were being led outside of the Amazon rainforest. But even my own perception, I would say, has evolved. And I think that yoga has actually been a big help for me in trying to grasp the nature of what I see as the globalization of ayahuasca specifically, but maybe the globalization of psychedelic therapy. Because yoga, was and still is a very, very deep spiritual practice. It's a very, very deep healing practice that originated as a result of ancestral tradition and plant medicine science. And then it was shared, and it was taught, and it was brought all over the world. And so just like there are ceremonies happening all over the world, you can go, every single town has yoga classes happening now too. And also, I'm sure there's probably some statistics on how many people get injured every year doing yoga, how many hospital visits there are from people doing yoga, how many teachers are leading yoga classes that don't even have adequate training, and so there's a lot of similarities, but yet that has happened, where that's like, we can look back at that, it's still happening, but it's kind of like complete, the globalization of yoga. Every single town has yoga everywhere in the world. And so does that mean that you shouldn't take a yoga class? Well, I wouldn't say that. I think that yoga is beneficial. And even though I would say that it's been watered down, and that most likely you're not going to actually take a yoga class led by someone that knows the depth of the tradition from its ancestral paradigm, it's still, the potential for the benefit that you will receive from taking the yoga class is still there. And, as a whole, globally speaking, if I had to measure the benefit against the detriment of yoga, it would be in the positive. That it has made a positive contribution to global society by being available to us. And so I can only predict that plant medicine and psychedelic therapy will have a similar effect. There will be casualties, there will be hospital visits, there will be people that, don't know what they're doing, and maybe they're leading people astray. But if we are to look at it from a global measurement or from a global perspective, in the end, we're actually going to still say that the overall effect is more positive than negative. And I guess I can't, I'm not sure if I could say that if I were to do that same measurement for pharmaceutical medication.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I think it's great to tie it into my last question, would be the massive movement of awakening to the plant medicine globally. and what the future of psychedelic therapy holds. Where are we going with all of this happening now, especially the last decade, right? Last decade has been very, very huge in terms of awakening to the plant medicine sciences. So what are your thoughts for the future and now and what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, like, I don't think that it can really be like compartmentalized. So while we want to say medicine and maybe separate that from politics and separate that from business and, you know, have all these different separate categories, what I would love to see and what I do see is a return to the earth and a return to the recognition that we are a part of the earth, that we are made of nature. We are quite literally and indisputably made of earth. And so a return to earth, to me, a return of our focus and our attention and our energy to the energy of our being, that is the great being, that is the planetary being, that is the consciousness of the planet, and connecting to that consciousness as a guide to lead us forward, then I'm very, very optimistic about how the earth will be healed and how we will be a contributing force in the healing of the planet. And so you know, I feel like plant medicine is kind of acting in the same way as maybe white blood cells act in our understanding of the immune system. But it's ultimately a giant collaboration. And I know that I feel blessed every day to feel a part of this collaboration. And I think that that feeling is certainly spreading. And I definitely recognize psychedelic therapy to be, you know, like the motivating or inspiration for that force of feeling.
Yeah, 100%. I'm with you. I think we're going to see a very different world in the next 5 to 10, maybe sooner. I do believe so. There is, I read a little article where it said the medicines, they have their own agenda. It's coming in like the web of life, you know, how it just kind of connects people. I feel it's true. Like we're all connecting from globally, we're connecting in this space, and the intention is there. Intention is always to connect and heal. And I'm a huge believer in people innately being good and wanting to do good in the world. And I think we're kind of returning to the natural state and kind of stripping away the conditioning, the layers, so that we can come to more neutral and more kind of accepting and loving. And that's the intention. So as we come to the end of our conversation, I definitely would like to invite you again for maybe Dayata, but just quickly, what can you say to us about Dayata? I'm sure like we'll have you back again, and definitely deserves a whole podcast on its own to go into it. But for now, the difference between just attending to a regular retreat to as opposed to Dayata.
Oh man, it's a more complex topic than to talk about healing, to be quite honest. But ultimately, like I said, it's a relationship building exercise with the spirit of a particular plant. And, you know, a lot of it is very, very consciousness based and very spirit based. But there's a lot of correlation between our own understanding of relationships and what we're willing to give up for relationships as a demonstration of our determination and commitment in those relationships. Marriage to me is probably the perfect example. It is quite literally a contract that you sign with another person, and built into that contract are sacrifices and what you're willing to give up for the depth of the relationship that you will achieve with that other individual. It's very, very similar to that, except that the time frame is established within the contract as well, which might actually be a great idea for human marriage as well, to not just say till death do us part, but maybe just say till 7 years from now or something. But yeah, it's ultimately like a contract for a committed relationship, and the involvement of that is the demonstration of determination. That's about as best I can do in a simplified form to describe it. I did want to talk one last thing, and hopefully maybe this will be the last statement to end it all. But yeah, you know, you never try to find a better way to do something if the way that you're doing it is working great. But when things aren't working, that's when you realize without choice, really, that you have to make a big improvement. And to me, that's the process of evolution. So, an animal would never evolve if everything was going great. It's crisis, it's the threat of survival that motivates evolutionary leaps. And so humans haven't evolved, Homo sapiens haven't evolved in over 100,000 years because everything has basically been fine. It's just good enough. We don't actually need to change our being. But if we are faced with a crisis that is a threat to the survival of the human race, then evolution and an evolutionary leap is inevitable. And so I'm very hopeful that we will look back, or future generations rather, will look back at this time and say, wasn't that awesome that we got to a point where the evolutionary leap was inevitable, so that we can now be Homo luminous, or whatever the next stage in our evolution might be.
One of the things that I'm really interested in the Ayahuasca Foundation offers is the training. Can you speak to us a little bit about the training? What does it look like, and who qualifies to attend? And I know it happens in Iquitos. Maybe you can talk to us a bit about that as well.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not going to have too much time, so I'll try to run through it real quick, which is also a challenge because it's a pretty deep topic. We've had 42 of these 8-week courses, the initiation course, as we call it. It is designed as a training program to teach the principles of the Shipibo tradition. It does involve plant dietas with the bioluminescent tree I mentioned, Noyorao, as well as 4 other plants that you choose for the second dieta. Ultimately, it's the best attempt to teach those principles, teach that paradigm, teach that perspective, that way of understanding, and the ideologies and methodologies associated with not just leading ceremonies, but treating patients with plant medicines in the Shipibo tradition. What it takes to qualify is kind of a difficult thing to describe, but I guess I would say compassion. I would say heart. People. It's not a quality that you can just learn. So I have a lengthy application process, and then I speak with each applicant to try to figure out if I recognize that. I do the best that I can to accept the people that I do. But ultimately, my take on it really is similar to. I'm a big fan of metaphors, by the way. It's similar to learning instruments. Someone can learn how to play the guitar, but not really be that gifted. And so, they could play the guitar for 20 years and just reality that they're not that good at it. Whereas some kid picks up guitar and 2 years later, he's phenomenal and he's up on stage playing concerts because he's got that gift. So, healing is an art form as well. It's similar in the sense that you have people who have gifts, but also like music, the person that plays guitar and just isn't that good at it, that just means they're not going to be up on stage, but they're probably still going to play songs that people enjoy to have them to hear them play, just on a smaller level, on a community level, maybe just in their family. Learning to play an instrument, you'll still learn how to play, even though you might not be gifted. And so I take that attitude as well with the course, that some people on the course will certainly be gifted and they'll go on to not just lead ceremonies, but establish their own centers or design their own churches. We have participants that have completed our courses that have their own churches in the United States and are practicing the medicine as a rite of religion, and centers in Denmark and Portugal and South Africa and Netherlands and all, across the globe. But whether or not it's a center or whether or not they're practicing as a practitioner, has a lot to do with the legality of it, which thankfully we're seeing change as well. So it's all, it's quite complex in what the course teaches, but it's kind of a leap of faith when you know that it's your path. It's a great way to start that path.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for doing that. And this is my personal question. Earlier you said that you have your one foot in the West and the one foot in the, the indigenous part of the world. what is the one thing, if you was to just say to us, like, that stood out for you the most in your learning your own self journey, that you saw that, oh my God, wow, of course, what was that aha moment?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I alluded to it in my description of trauma, but the most important lesson that I've learned in my life, and I do attribute it to my work with plant medicine, is that it is not about what happens to you. It is about how you respond to what happens to you. Because how you respond determines how you interpret the experience, and how you interpret the experience determines how you remember the experience. And your memory of the experience is what you refer to as reality. And so you have the power to transform your reality and to dictate your reality, because you have the ability to respond to your experiences. So it doesn't really matter what experiences you have. Your ability to respond is your true responsibility, and that will determine your reality.
Wow, that's so powerful. Thank you so much. So what's it looking like for the Ayahuasca Foundation, the future? I know you're probably carrying on. Is there any new projects coming up, or you're just going to keep offering the retreats and the education side?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been taking like a new branch, talking to you, doing podcasts, kind of trying to make myself a spokesperson for ancestral psychedelic therapy to ensure that the context of its use is considered, if not made, the central focus of this emerging new field. So, we became a founding member of the Psychedelic Medicine Association last year, and I'll be continuing to work on that. Hopefully, I'll be on a PBS special that comes out next year, as well as another program on the Bloomberg network. So I'm going to be like working personally to try to bring more voice to the ancestral tradition in the context of ideology and methodology within the ancestral paradigm. But yeah, like as far as our company is concerned, we'll continue to offer those retreats. We are already underway with the stage 2 study, and so we'll be continuing that research as well. And yeah, we'll just keep on keeping on.
Amazing. Thank you so much for spending the time here with us and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. I can't wait to share your links and your offerings with our listeners, and hope to have you back on a part 2.
Yeah, I would love to come back and just talk all about dieta. It's certainly like the most hard to understand, but also most important aspect of the healing tradition of ayahuasca.
Amazing. Look forward to it. Thank you, Carlos. All the best with all your future projects and endeavors. All right.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Please do get in touch with Carlos and myself. If there's any questions, drop them in the comments, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye for now. Much love. Thank you so much for joining us. Psychedelic Conversations podcast is designed to educate, inform, and expand awareness. For more information, please head over to psychedelicconversations.com. You can also share with your friends or leave a review so that we can reach more people. You can also join us in our private Facebook group to keep the conversation going. This show is for information purposes only, and it is not intended to provide mental health or medical advice. Thanks for listening.